today's episode of the SSPX Podcast, we'll continue our Apologetics Series by looking squarely and unapologetically at some of the worst men who have ever sat on the throne of St. Peter. And there have been more than a few. What are we as Catholics to think about this? How can the Catholic Church be true, be inspired by God, if these men were at the helm? And what can historically bad popes throughout the last 1,000 years and more teach Catholics in the 21st century? You can find notes to all of these episodes at sspxpodcast.com/apologetics, as well as all of our previous episodes. There as well, you can find a link to help support this project. This is free to listen to, as well as all of the resources we're posting, but if you can help with a one-time or a small monthly recurring donation, you'll be making sure that we can continue this work of producing good Catholic content on a regular basis. Now let's join Dr. John Rao for episode number 24 of the Apologetics Series here on the SSPX Podcast. Dr. Rao, great to have you back again. And for people who are very astute and watching us on YouTube, yes, we are wearing the same clothes. Yes, we are recording this. It's the same day as last week's episode. A little behind the scenes. So thanks for doing this marathon session with me today. On this episode, we're going to be talking about bad popes. There have been bad popes, and how do we combat this, or how do we answer these questions in an apologetical way? The first thing you have on your outline that you passed along to me ahead of time was this question, and I have no idea what it is. So I'm curious, what are, quote, the tears of St. Peter?
Well, that's the first indication of why we can expect that there might be bad popes. The term itself is one that's popularized by a man whose name was Auerbach, who wrote a great work called Mimesis, in which he talks about the importance of Christianity for being able to really probe human behavior and human feeling, because he talks about the fact, I'm going to mention this in an article, well, by the point people see this program, the article will have appeared in the Angelus, but I'm going to address this a bit in an article there. He talks about the fact that there was no possibility for the ancients to be able to depict psychologically the tears of St. Peter when he realized he's betrayed Christ, that he has done exactly what Christ predicted that he would do. And the reason I brought it up here for our point is that, we've got from the very beginning an indication that the first pope could do something that he ought not to do, betray Christ, and betray Christ in a public manner as well. Now, here he's done something. He has not infallibly taught anything that was wrong, but he has certainly done something which was wrong. All right. And that should be a clue to tell us that we should not be surprised if we find that throughout the entire history of the church, there have been popes who have done bad things, and some of them that have done many, many bad things for, thankfully, often not that long periods of time. I think I suggested as a question, towards the end, something which I can mention right now. One thing that struck me as a historian is the fact that when you compare the record of the papacy with the record of the episcopacy in general, the papacy comes off pretty well. The episcopacy in general does not come off as well as the papacy does.
Yeah, fair enough. So there seems to be this, and sedevacantism is an error that's kind of come about. I mean, I'm sure there have been sedevacantists in periods in the past, but it seems to be a much more recent development. But there is this confusion about, there just can't be a bad pope. I think people seem to confuse infallibility with impeccability, meaning the pope can't sin. Right. And there's two different kind of people who are arguing the same exact thing in very different ways, and that's the conservative camp and the sedevacantist camp, right?
Right. They both share this argument that you can't have a pope that does something which is reprehensible, and even reprehensible purely on a doctrinal or intellectual level, aside from any kind of personal personal immoral behavior. It's interesting because in both cases, this then cuts off your ability to be able to discuss um, uh, uh, church policies and papal policies. You can't have any discussion, because if you have the perfect pope, then you have to accept everything that he does. Or if you have the imperfect pope, then you have to, just reject him as being pope entirely. But you get the same result. You can't discuss papal policy. And interestingly enough, at the time of First Vatican Council, uh, some of the most important promoters of the doctrine of infallibility made it crystal clear what was and what was not being defined at the time. I'm thinking of right now the Archbishop of Malines, Deschamps, who, if you read still what is probably the best book on First Vatican Council by Butler, he's got long passages where he describes exactly what it is that they knew the Pope was being said that he was incapable of teaching, whereas they knew quite well that Pope could do something that was wrong. In a way, I mean, not that I mean this seriously, but it might have been better if we immediately had a Pope who had done something that was pretty awful, so that we could have an example of it. But we had this run, we had this run of popes who, for the course of the 19th century and the bulk of the 20th century were such models that created an impression about what the Pope was like that's not necessarily reflected in all of history.
Right. It is. There's a lot of recency bias in the way that we're looking at the papacy. Again, looking at the Leo the 13th, the Pius X, Pius IX, etc.
Right.
So to kind of go back a little bit, not to start looking at specific examples, but what do you mean a bad pope? The title of this is, looking at all the bad popes, but there's different ways that a pope can be bad. Obviously, currently in this moment, if you agree that there's a crisis in the church, you would agree that there are some teachings of Pope Francis and previous few popes that have been improper or incorrect or, not edifying. But there's all different flavors of being a bad pope, right?
Right. Yes. I mean, there's before our time, in our recent era, and especially this current pontificate, before our time, when you're talking about bad popes, you've had mostly these examples that were given of people who were personally immoral, whether at the time they were pope or sometime in their previous history, or popes who were too political in their approach, and as a result of that, ignored the spiritual well-being of the church in order to promote their specific temporal goals. Or you have a few examples of popes who were intellectually confused or not awakened enough, and therefore contributed to a situation in which heretical views were allowed to be promoted, but not in the same way that we've got being promoted, let's say, underneath the current pontificate. You don't have that same example of it. But mostly through the period after the ancient world, you've got through the Middle Ages and even extending into the period up to the French Revolution, examples given of popes who were either too political or immoral in their behavior.
Can you give me some examples of what you mean when you say overly political or bad behavior? I guess we can use our imagination about bad behavior, but if you want to get into that too, fine. But what are some examples, some striking examples that come to mind, Dr. Rao?
Well, let's start out with the non-bad behavior ones to begin with, okay? And if we're talking about things chronologically, we have the example. Forget Pope Liberius, but you've got Pope Honorius, Pope Honorius at the beginning of the 600s. Now, this is an interesting case because this is a personally very good man, a personally very, very good man, a personally very, very good man who is also a fervent supporter of the whole approach of Pope St. Gregory the Great, right? Because Gregory the Great is just shortly before him. And Pope St. Gregory the Great's approach is very much one that is concerned with the need for dealing with a Christian world that has been badly degraded, let's say, in various ways by the barbarian invasions. And you need to be able to, especially when you're talking about things on an educational level, popularize the faith in a way that might have left, Christians of the older Roman training cringe because of the fact that you don't have the same educational level that you had even in, let's say, the late 400s and early 500s. It's just different. So he's very much a popularizer, Pope St. Gregory the Great. Honorius inherits that, and Honorius inherits that in a way that makes him willing to look down upon all of the more subtle doctrinal disputes that were still very, very much being treated seriously in a way that was on a higher level in the Eastern world, in the Greek world, the Greek-speaking world. Now, that higher educational level and that devotion to doctrine that is very much being still cultivated in the Greek-speaking world is going to have an influence once again in the West and have an influence in Rome, and very, very soon also following Pope Honorius. But when Honorius is around and first hears of what's going to become a huge doctrinal dispute, the dispute over Monophysitism, not Monophysitism, the Monothelites. When he hears about this, he hears about it from sources that don't want him to take it seriously, and he's inclined not to take it seriously as well. And so he makes fun of people who do treat it seriously, and he talks about theologians who take this seriously as the voice of croaking frogs, And a lot, his language in this respect, reminds one of Pope Francis and some of the things that he says. And this is going to be a cause of very great embarrassment for the Roman See afterwards, because the Roman See is very swiftly going to become a center of resistance to this heresy that Honorius treated as though it was, silly. Now, it's because he didn't understand that these things are serious, and this thing was serious, that he dismissed it in this way, to be followed by popes who in effect are confessors and martyrs. A pope who's a confessor and martyr, St. Martin, who is also guided by one of the great thinkers and defenders of the Roman See, St. Maximus the Confessor. They're the great defenders, but so much is Honorius an embarrassment that he was actually condemned by the Third Council of Constantinople for having done so. Now, I mean, again, this was brought up for discussion at the time of the First Vatican Council, because also having one's behavior attacked is not the same thing as saying that somebody has said something, has taught something which is erroneous. He didn't teach anything that's erroneous. He dismissed the controversy. But as a result of that, he's come down in our history as a bad pope, but he's not a bad pope in that sense. He's a bad pope for having intellectually not been aware of what does become a problem that a Roman pontiff after him is going to suffer for as well. But he's come down to us in those ranks. All right, that's one example. All right, if you leap farther ahead to political popes, when you talk about political popes, for example, Pope Martin IV, 1281 to, when did he die? In 1285. Pope Martin IV, a good man, very good man, but very much in this mold of a number of popes in the 1200s and 1300s who thought that they could politically mold everything to be exactly correctly organized in order to be able to defend the relationship of church and state around Europe. And it's the sort of problem that Saint Bernard of Clairvaux had warned about already in the 1100s to his pupil who become Pope Eugenius III, in that if you put too much emphasis on the temporal, the political, the legal, the bureaucracy, the money that you need to be able to run all of this this stuff, you're going to lose track of the hierarchy of values. And the hierarchy of values is one that tells us that it's the ultimate spiritual goal of the church, which always overrides everything else. So Martin IV gets involved in this last, or one of the last stages of the battle of the papacy with the empire, focused in Germany, but which had then involved who was in control of the area of southern Italy and Sicily, and the desire on the part of the Roman pontiffs not to have the man who had the title of emperor and was king of Germany to also have the title of ruler of kingdom, the kingdom of Sicily. In fact, I forget which historian it is who said that Sicily was the graveyard of the medieval papacy, because this constant effort to make sure that the right guy was there in charge of Sicily and southern Italy just got you bogged down in more and more and more political hoo-ha. And what he did was he decided, because the papacy, as it was having these battles, got more and more convinced that in order to defeat the wicked family of the Hohenstaufen, who had the title of emperor under their control, and also that of the ruler of Sicily, you had to favor the wonderful family of the Capetians in France. So what he does is he gets one of the Capetians, a man named Charles of Anjou, to become the agent of the papacy. But the problem is that everybody down there in Sicily can't stand Charles of Anjou. And as a result, if you have that dynasty in charge down there, it's going to then reflect back on the power of the papacy and the reputation of the papacy in a way that brings down the spiritual with the temporal. And this whole issue of what's going on down there is going to continue. It already had been going on for some decades now, and it's going to continue in a way that's going to just plague the papacy and contribute really to its discrediting in these matters in those horrible centuries of the 1300s and the 1400s. Another one is Pope Clement what is he? I can't remember his number there, seventh, I think, in the 1520s, because he's just constantly politically maneuvering in order to try to protect himself in a way that makes him look like he's betraying everybody. And it's his political shenanigans that end up getting Rome in 1527 sacked by angry troops that were working for Charles V, who hadn't been paid, and who decided that the best way that they could end up getting paid was by going down to Rome and sacking it and gaining a cult compensation in that fashion. He ends up there's all kinds of poems that are produced about Clement because of the fact that he looks this way and then that way and the other way, and you never know which side he's really on. He's the bane of the existence of a number of the reform groups that were very active already in the 1520s, who complained that with all of his attention focused on politics, he's ignoring the fact that he's destroying the reputation of the Roman Church, and then all sorts of corrupt people are able to utilize very easy exemptions from one kind of canonical rule or another that he and the Curia working under him are giving. An example of a person who complains about him vigorously in this regard is a man who is a deep reformer of great renown, who is going to become Pope himself a little bit later on, who also gets, ironically, in a different way, the reputation of being too political a Pope. And that is a man whose name is Carafa, who comes from Naples, who was one of the most powerful leaders of the Reform order, which is known as the Theatines. And Carafa, who very much is committed to the goals of the Theatines, who want the clergy, their clergy, the people who are part of them, to be absolutely and totally poor, totally poor. And Carafa is already an influential figure at the time of Clement, Pope Clement in the 1520s, and he writes him letters and says, what you're doing is something which just is taking your attention away from what it is that really counts. And the people who are operating in your name are utilizing your name to permit all kinds of abuses in church life. It doesn't get anywhere. Then when he became Pope as Pope Paul IV later on in the 1550s, I think we already mentioned this in a previous episode, that he unfortunately, as a reformer, and he's a ferocious reformer, and does things as a ferocious reformer which are really, really out of this world, but which create a completely different Rome by the time he's done. He also has got this idea that he's got to do everything politically absolutely accurately in order to create the conditions for a pure relationship of church and state. And he's one of the people who, in the 1550s, is upset about the fact that governments like the government of Spain have too much authority over church affairs, and have got too much of authority because they're too powerful in general, including being in control of southern Italy and Sicily. And he goes to war with Philip II, Paul IV, which is absurd because there's no way that he can possibly win it, and is very much going to ultimately be brought down in terms of his ability to rule effectively because of that war. But this is a man who's a good man, but doing things politically so irresponsible that his whole ability to rule collapses. Let me just mention one of the things that he does as a reformer that leaves Rome a completely different city. I've mentioned this in a number of lectures, maybe some of which you've heard in the past. But for example, there are all of these priests and monks who are there in Rome without any reason for being there. And it's the sort of thing that he was upset about in the 1520s, that he was complaining to Clement about, that these wandering monks and priests are up to no good and they give the church a bad name. So he ordered them all to leave and go back to their monasteries in their own diocese. And of course, since people had not been enforcing these rules, nobody paid any attention to him. Then he gave them a second chance and ordered them, and he didn't. They didn't pay any attention. Then he gave them a third chance, and then closed down the entrances to the city and sent the papal police through the whole city to swoop up all of these monks and priests who had nothing to do, and then punish them by sending them rowing in the Mediterranean in papal ships so that they could learn how to shape up as a result of it. That ended the problem in Rome. That ended it. But as a good man who does bad things. All right, so you've got politically, just politically. So you got situations like that that are the case, or people who are just, some people who are just too spiritual, and then are able to be manipulated, with the classic example of that being Celestine. Pope Celestine, Saint Celestine, who is, Pope for just a few months in 1294, followed by Boniface VIII, after you'd had this horrific vacancy in the papal see, and then finally you get this very, very ascetic monk elected Pope. This is Pope Celestine, and he's virtually kept a kind of spiritual prisoner by the king down there in Naples at the time period. And everyone who is astute can see that he's so focused on spiritual matters that he's allowing the entire affair, all the affairs of the church, to be dominated by this political leader. So that's why they convince him to abdicate, although he's so holy that his abdication is treated by Dante as a great crime, so he's sent to hell by Dante. And again, the next pope who abdicates under these circumstances is Benedict. Benedict the 16th, and his abdication is going to be treated by many people with the same kind of anger as Dante treated that of Celestine.
Yeah.
Interestingly enough, he also, Benedict, is a man who was, despite his, his theological speculations, which are, were at times wild, and his commitment to this hermeneutic of continuity, was himself personally, I think, an extremely spiritually minded figure, and then an academic genius as well. I'm just preparing a lecture, my final lecture on this church history series that I'm going to be giving on May 21st, just a few days after we're filming this. And when he had his last audience before he abdicated, one person who was in the crowd afterwards was talking to the police chief at the Vatican, and the police chief was crying, said he was just personally too pure to have this position, So, and he himself then says afterwards, "I'm just not a good administrator." So I don't know.
Right.
But so I mean, is he a bad pope? Well, I mean, that's a question.
That's a question for history to decide, and future popes to decide later.
Yeah.
Certainly. It's fascinating. There's like we mentioned at the beginning, there's all these different flavors. There's good popes who do bad things. There's personally motivated,
Right.
greedy popes. Now, what about that last part? Someone who is maybe morally not up to snuff, a person who's elected pope who's not morally up to snuff, can they still do good things for the church?
Yes, they can. I mean, we've got well, I mean, these are two quite different figures in a way, but they're both attacked for being bad popes in different ways. But I mean, let's take the example of Pope Alexander VI and then Julius II. You've got the following one another. Julius, who comes after Alexander VI, was so horrified by Alexander VI that he didn't want to sleep in the same bedroom that he slept in. When we talk about Julius, I mean, well, what do we think? We think about a military man, right? A military man who's there spending all of his time he's in uniform, he's fighting. Is that a good pope? Is that a good pope? Um, he he's very much concerned about putting the papal states on a firm military and political and economic footing. By the same token, he is also very much committed to trying to do certain things to bring back a discipline among the clergy at the time. And he was horrified by the fact that the primary concern of Alexander VI seemed to be not really the putting of the papal states on a firm footing for the sake of the long-term benefit of the church, but for the sake of his family, for the sake of the children that he had, and the children that he had not while he was pope, but when he was, beforehand, himself a wayward figure, just as Paul III, who became pope and did all of the things that were necessary for giving an open door to the Council of Trent, the Jesuits, any number of other groups and activities that created the Catholic Reformation. In his youth was a wayward figure that people could make reference to, and then sort of brand him as a bad pope later on. And then Alexander VI does a lot of things politically that are also morally reprehensible. So did a previous pope before, in Sixtus IV, do all sorts of things that are morally, rather reprehensible, involving potentially allowing his own family members to be involved in assassination plots. And yet Alexander VI, if I'm not mistaken, wrote a beautiful encyclical on the Blessed Sacrament. And there's nothing that happens in terms of promoting bad teaching in any way that I can think of underneath certainly the reign of Julius II. Julius, who's got a reforming council going on as well, that no one ever speaks of anymore, the Fifth Lateran Council. No one ever speaks of it. I think it continues into the reign of Leo X afterwards. But yeah, I mean, there's things that can be done by people who are morally maybe not up to snuff, but ultimately of value. Paul III, let's go back to him again, the Farnese family. I mean, he's got his grandchildren there serving him in the church, right? His grandchildren serving him in the church, but he himself and Charles V is so angry at the Farnese family of Paul III that it kind of poisons the relationship of church and state underneath the reign of Paul III and Charles V in the 1530s and 1540s. And there are things that Paul III does that just simply cause him to shove all of the great reform actions that he takes at the time period completely out of the picture, if it means that his family's benefit is going to be pursued. All right, so he's complex. And he is also someone who causes people who are 100% reform-minded and against whom you can find no kind of reproach to make while they're alive, headaches galore. His legates at the first session of the Council of Trent are at least one of them is tortured by the actions of Paul III, because he's got this one good thing he's doing, the Council of Trent, and then he's he's destroying what he's doing because he's more concerned about the benefit of the Farnese family in a way that that throws all of the business of the council into jeopardy over and over again. You know?
Yeah. So just those are some of the specific examples. Again,
And we
good
haven't
guys
got
doing
really bad ones.
yeah, right. Good guys doing bad stuff, bad guys doing good stuff. What about, well, what are some other examples that you want to give? Because
Well, I mean, the classic examples is this wretched period from the late 800s um, through to the 1000s, when you finally get the reform of the church that creates the glories of the High Middle Ages firmly into place. And there are intervening periods of uh, of efforts being made in order to be able to reform things that are repeatedly defeated um, by the return of the bad popes. Now, the general there's really two general frameworks for really bad popes, really bad popes. One one is when you've got a rut established, and that's the kind of thing that you get established in the 1400s and the early 1500s. You've got a rut, and by rut, what I mean is that you've got uh, all of the machinery that was created for a strong papacy that was created in the High Middle Ages. You've got the strong machinery all running with its standard operating procedures, but you've got that standard operating procedures, those standard operating procedures and the machinery in the hands of popes who are more concerned for their own family's well-being or political matters, whatever it might be. And the standard operating procedures of a strong machine just kind of they just move along doing what it is that the governing pope wants it to do, without any kind of questioning. And the people who are the reformers, who want to stop bad things from happening, find that they are chastised as being radical troublemakers, because the standard operating procedures of the Roman Curia and the Roman Church are obviously what it is that's needed to keep the strength of the papacy going, and you're trying here to throw wrenches into the machinery. And in fact, you know what you've got there when you have the arguments of these people under these kinds of circumstances operated. You've got the basic problem that you have with the conservatives nowadays. The conservatives say, this is what the Pope is doing, this is what the machinery of the church does, therefore it's correct, and therefore you go along with it. And if you complain about it, you're the problem and not the machinery of the church. Now, the other kind of example is when you don't even have any machinery really operating seriously any longer, whether because of troubles politically of one sort or another, or lack of money, or chaos around you, and you've just got simply local strong forces that are competing for control of the papacy. And that's what you had as a situation that had developed with the competing local Roman noble families of the late 800s and the 900s and the 1000s. And what you've got is a kind of Wild West show that's developed there. And you don't have an established set of standard operating procedures. You've just got Billy the Kids, in effect, fighting for things, sometimes picking somebody who has an outward sign of somewhat respectability as a front man for you, but oftentimes just having really reprehensible characters from among these families who are in control. And it's at one point in the 900s, you've got one family that basically is in control of things called the Theophylact family. But you've got fights among families in the late 800s and then in the 900s, leading to the domination of this other family for a while, and then other families that were battling over things. And I wanted to be ready for this. So I pulled up on my computer, some indications of who we're talking about here, and I wanted to make sure that I had them in front of me, and so I could cite them for you. So you
Sure.
get figures like Pope Stephen VI. He's Pope between 1896 896 and 897, and he's the one who presided over the famous Cadaver Synod. I don't know if you know of the Cadaver Synod, where his predecessor, Pope Formosus, they had his body pulled up, and the rotted body was put on trial in its robes, and then they found it guilty. They deprived it of 3 fingers, and then they tossed it into the Tiber. Then what happened is that he was finally killed, Stephen VI, and he was strangled. All right, he was strangled. Now he was followed by Pope Sergius III. Pope Sergius III was Pope from 897 to 911. And I just pulled up one description of him, but if you match it with almost every description of it, you get the same thing. The only pope known to have ordered the murder of another pope. He was the one who ordered the murder of Stephen VI. The only one known to have fathered an illegitimate son who later became pope. It's in his reign that historians talk about there beginning in Rome a papacy which they call more a pornocracy than a papacy, because it's involved with all of these, shenanigans of one sort or another. Then you've got Pope, let's see which one we have coming next here that I wanted to mention. Pope John the 12th, Pope from 955 to 964. 964. He had his battles with the King of Germany, Otto I, who came down to Rome and finally was recrowned Roman Emperor. He reestablishes the title of Roman Emperor after a period of the title falling in abeyance, and everybody agrees that John the 12th was personally immoral. Whether all the accusations that Otto has against them are true or not has been debated by people. But in any case, Otto summoned a council which claimed that John had ordained a deacon in the stable. He had consecrated a 10-year-old boy as the Bishop of Todi. He had converted the Lateran Palace into a brothel. He had raped female pilgrims at St. Peter's. He'd stolen church offerings. He'd drunk toasts to the devil and invoked the aid of Jove, Venus, and other pagan gods when playing dice. But in any case, he does seem to have been beaten to death by the husband of a woman with whom he was having an affair. All right, he's certainly immoral. He's certainly immoral. Then you get, and I'll just end with this one, Pope Benedict IX. Pope Benedict IX was Pope in 3 stages. He was Pope between 1032 and 1044, then again in 1045, and then 1047 to 1048. He gave up his papacy the first time because he sold it. He sold it in 1044. Oh. He returned in 1045 to depose his replacement and reigned for 1 month. Then he left it because he sold the papacy again a second time, right? He finally was thrown out entirely. Saint Peter Damian described him as, quote, feasting on immorality and a demon from hell in the disguise of a priest. And he says this in his famous book, The Liber Gomorrhianus, in which he accuses him of other crimes, which I won't mention here publicly for your audience. I mean, the things that that people have said about even popes have said about their predecessors in this regard are mind-boggling. Mostly, they've been kind enough to say that the best thing that they could say about their predecessor was never to mention his name again, because it was for the benefit of the church for him to just simply fall completely into oblivion. All right, so you get
Wow.
batches of bishops like this. Then the question comes up: if you have such a bad pope, how do you get rid of him?
Well, that was going to be my next question, because it sounds like you said that he was thrown out towards the end of his third papacy. So was it, based on recent scholarship, I'm talking recent last 500 years or so, it seems like, excuse me, there's no one who can judge the Pope because he is the supreme monarch of the church. You can't get rid of him. It can't be a council of cardinals, anything like that. Again, that's open to debate. But if you do have a Pope like this, how do you get rid of him?
Well, quite frankly, I think that there's a problem with regard to the church's understanding in this respect, because canon law has really not ever come up with a satisfactory argument in this regard. Right. And what you're left with is, on the one hand, the general conviction that you can't get rid of a pope because no one can judge the pope. And then on the other hand, the church is praising the people who have got rid of popes, because their actions, which are in effect, because of the failure to address this whole issue fully, not justified, being accepted as having been good in the long run. And of course, the greatest examples of this come from the church's praise at the interference of the Holy Roman emperors in removing people like the man John, the man that Otto removes, and then their return to name people as popes like the man that we know of as Saint Leo the Ninth, who was pope in the 1000s, and then ultimately at the time of the Great Western Schism. I mean, what the emperor did at the time of the Great Western Schism is really not accepted by canon law. I mean, think of what the situation was like at the time of that Great Western Schism. You have three people claiming to be pope. And that brings up the name of another oddity among the popes. One of them, the man who was pope at the time from the Avignon succession, Benedict XIII, who refused to resign. He refused to resign to allow for the election of another Pope, Martin V, the one who comes out of the Council of Constance. But you have the emperor managing to get a voluntary resignation or abdication of one of the candidates. You have another one who's kind of hounded into resigning. He actually fled in order to avoid resigning, but ultimately does. And then you get Benedict XIII, who refuses to resign and just goes. He's just off there for some years past the end of the Council of Constance that created Martin V. And there's really no serious indication of how you ultimately said that this was legitimate, how this worked out, except that everybody accepted it. There are other peculiarities that have remained. I mean, for example, one of the popes from the third line that came of popes that comes through the Council of Pisa took the title of Alexander. And when but he was considered to be an illegitimate pope with respect to the whole line. Certainly nowadays, he's considered to have been an illegitimate pope. However, when the next Roman pontiff, who took the term Alexander as pope, which is the Borgia pope that we just mentioned before, he took as his number the number after this man who's not considered to have been a legitimate pope. Now, why? He should be a previous Alexander, but no, it's very awkward. You know, I once asked the cardinal. I don't want to mention the cardinal's name because I don't want to put him. Well, he's no longer with us, but put him on the spot anyway. But I once asked him about some of these issues, and from the answer I got from him, it seemed to me to be that they really don't have an answer.
Yeah.
And the answer is that acceptance seems to be an indication of what acceptance of something which has clearly worked out for the benefit of the church as a whole is what has been considered to been the proof of that what has happened is legitimate. And that's why also I'm very, very hesitant to talk about, you know, too many battles over whether was this precisely right, was that precisely wrong, was this precisely okay? Because when you look at some of the circumstances in church history regarding elections, there's been a lot of shenanigans, and it's very tricky.
Yeah. It does boggle the mind as to how the church can get out of these situations. And it seems to, it's, you know, what I always think of is, it's kind of like squatters' rights, where it's like, all right, if this is the situation, this is how it is, fine, in order to maintain peace. And I think the church has a similar doctrine in canon law. I'm no canon law expert at all, but I think the church has a similar doctrine where it's like, if there is peace and there's recognized stability, fine, accept this as the law, even if the methods by which it got there are not as good. We accept that to be the norm or the standing reality of the situation.
Right. I mean, you know, to talk about things immediately, the immediate case, and in you know, in our own situation, my own attitude towards the current pontiff is the attitude, I forget which literary critic it was, but there was a French literary critic, I think in the 20th century, who was asked who was the greatest French novelist, and his answer was Victor Hugo, alas. You know, alas. And my attitude is the current pontiff the legitimate pontiff? And my attitude is yes, alas. You know, alas.
Yeah.
Because it's very difficult. I mean, Benedict said that he accepted this. Then, of course, you'd have people say, well, Benedict wasn't the legitimate pope.
Sure.
And nobody's been the legitimate pope since Pius XII. But
sure.
I mean, it seems to me that the tradition of the church indicates that this question of acceptance is big. Do you know the book, The Mitre and the Crook?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, there you've got another example with respect to the question before about can a bad pope do good things? Because Brian Houghton in that book, the point of it is that the vicar general who becomes the next bishop, who is depicted as a rather slimy character, is going to continue with the good policy of the good man who had decided to stick with tradition. And his point there is the rather cynical one that once the crooks are on the side of the good, you know that we have a chance to keep going. I would hate to adopt that as my attitude, but it would mean therefore that the machinery was now running smoothly enough on behalf of something which was good, that even if you have a personally rather reprehensible person who's in charge of the whole thing, that maybe you can hope that it will run more smoothly. But the best to hope for is that we have saints as popes.
Yeah.
So, the three categories of popes: the political, the wise, the saint. We should have a political pope who's also wise, who's also a saint.
Yeah.
All of them.
Yeah. I'm going to ask you your broad thoughts on all of this as we close, but and we've already talked about a little bit about how do you if we have a bad pope right now, how would one propose to get rid of him if we even could? And I think the answer is we can't. At least not according to canon law.
No, we can pray. We can pray. I have a friend of mine who says, well, we can pray that he has a turnaround.
Yeah.
Because the best thing that would happen is St. Augustine, in one of his debates with one of his Donatist enemies, did the best thing imaginable. He converted him. So we can pray that he he turns around, because the best thing that could possibly happen would be that he turns around and denounces the things that we don't like that he's done.
Yeah.
Up until now. That would be the best thing that could possibly happen. We can pray that that he cease doing the things that he's doing that are causing difficulties. And I think that we can pray, as this friend of mine. I don't think it's unchristian to pray that if he does not turn around and does not cease to do the things that he does, that we can pray that he ceases to be pope, because that could mean that he resigns. That could mean a number of different things.
Sure.
But it would be wicked to pray for something which was evil.
Yes.
And we can pray, or we can pray that God does something to save his church. I think it's really very, very interesting. Something that I may have made. I think I may have brought this up in a previous discussion, but in preparing this last lecture on Benedict, I find it very interesting that the comment that he makes about the third secret of Fatima, while John Paul II was still alive, which talks about what happened with the assassination attempt as having somehow or other brought the historic aspect of Fatima to an end. Something that he says completely different. He completely changes when he goes to Fatima again in, I think it's 2010. He goes back to Portugal, and he says those who believe that the historical message of Fatima, the historical meaning of Fatima has come to an end, are not correct. All right. So I think that this very, very intelligent man, and I think a very personally good man, with a flawed hermeneutic of continuity, I think even he reaches towards the end of his pontificate an awareness that this is not working out the way that it ought to, and we are living in times which may well be apocalyptic times. But he says, and I think this is pastorally a very good thing, he says, remember that for the Christian, the end times it means the second coming of Christ. It means something hopeful, not something that is fit for some sort of cinematic boom for people to revel in for bad purposes.
Sure. There's a push in all sorts of areas of our civilization today, especially based on the democratic norms that we all live in, that most of the world lives in, of transparency, of being publicly accountable, of having people be able to judge who's right and who's wrong, even if you're in positions of authority. In that vein, do you think it's a good thing or a bad thing for the church to admit its wrongs, to admit that it has bad popes? I did a podcast on this channel some time ago with Father Sherry about should the Pope have apologized for the problems in Canada with the Indigenous people? Going back to the previous episode we did on colonization, should the church admit that there are bad popes? Does it hurt the church for us to be transparent in the modern sense about this?
Well, I mean, I think that generally speaking, this willingness to talk about problems is really rather modern, you know. And I mean, people in the Middle Ages were not shocked by the fact that there were bad priests, bad bishops, bad popes, bad kings, bad anythings. And if you're talking about airing dirty laundry, the entirety of the Cluniac reform movement that created the High Middle Ages is one gigantic airing of dirty laundry. And in fact, when the papacy gets involved, when the Cluniac reformers manage to get control of the papacy, what the papacy does is it takes the papal show on the road. The history of the traveling popes is not something from the time of Paul VI onwards. It's what the popes did in the 1000s and the 1100s. They traveled around, and when they traveled around, they held reforming councils, and those reforming councils encouraged the airing of dirty laundry by everybody. What I don't like, and I find actually reprehensible, is the idea of the existing authorities deciding that what you do is you waste your time talking about past problems, because I mean, for one thing, you're engaging in a game here. I mean, that's something that you can certainly do at a university. That's something you can certainly do as part of an educational program. But for you to decide that what you're going to do is judge the behavior of people who are long gone, whose behavior, by the way, has already been judged in the books that the church utilizes and has stored in its libraries anyway. All you have to do is read Ludwig von Pastor's History of the Popes to know that it's filled with this with its condemnations of bad behavior and mistakes and the like. But to do that is not only reprehensible, because you're not allowing for anybody to defend himself, and which is awful. But it's also hypocritical, because this is being done publicly, in the presence of the most hypocritical governments and a hypocritical United Nations, and hypocritical global elite that is utilizing this for the purposes of just simply allowing the church to destroy its own reputation, while these forces themselves are engaged in the most horrendous crimes imaginable. It's just not the case that you do that. I mean, yes, you deal with your immediate problems, but here again, Benedict was brutalized by people in the press and in the clergy, and particularly the clergy from Germany, when he, dealing with the immediate problems of clerical abuse, which he was being accused of being the aider and abettor of, when what was happening was that everything that was that emerged that he was dealing with was really having its worst heyday in the 1970s and 80s. Most of the people that were a problem, that were brought to the fore in let's say 2009, 10, 11, were people who committed crimes in the 70s and the 80s, and perhaps into the 90s. He was then raked over the coals because of the fact that he said, well, actually, he said, this is the product of the whole sexual revolution of the 1960s.
Yeah.
but he ought to have combined that by saying the sexual revolution of the 1960s with the abdication by the church in the 1960s and 70s and onwards of its own disciplinary authority. And he was said, "Oh my gosh, this is the proof that the church is unrepentant. It's unrepentant." And those people who were accusing him of this, and I mean, I have the names in my head, but I'd have to hunt for them a little bit before I could come them out. They said that the answer to the church's the abuses of the 1970s and 80s and 90s was to declare that the abuses were not abuses, which is what they're doing right now. Instead of lamenting your failure in the past, what you had to do is to say, well, actually, there's no problem with homosexuality. There's no problem now with pederasty. There's no problem with anything. With all of these organizations that are benefiting from the destruction of the church, including now the United Nations with its call for horrendous changes in the education of little children to allow them to contemplate doing horrible things at young ages. I mean, this is diabolical. This is diabolical and just downright stupid as well.
Yeah, that's a fair point. All right, as we close, I'd like to ask you just kind of a more broad question.
Sure.
There was recently an expose on 60 Minutes about the Mormon Church, and I have a point. I'm getting to it, where they talked about this $100 billion, I don't remember how much, savings account, and how the Mormon Church is doing all sorts of improper things with the funds. And I watched that as a Catholic, and I go, yeah, see, the Mormon Church is corrupt. We all knew that. Right. And I'm on my high horse as a Catholic saying that. But then as I was thinking about it, I go, well, a non-Catholic could look at the church and particularly this list of bad popes that we just went through and say, see, the church is corrupt. See, there are all these examples. Mormon Church, that's one example of one issue. Look at the Catholic Church throughout all of its history. Awful popes. And Catholics, you say, by their fruits you shall know them. So Dr. Rao, what do you say kind of as a final word about all this? How do you answer this allegation? Yeah, we've gone through how, infallibility is not touched by that. We've gone at it from a scholarly point of view. We've looked at, you can't get rid of a pope from a canon law point of view, but just from a sense of, but it just seems really rotten. The Catholic Church does. How do you broadly answer that?
Well, I mean, I think first off, I'd go back to my one part of my argument to begin with that we talked about a little bit earlier in the session today, and that is the fact that if you look at, first of all, we never have argued that it was going to be, and this from scripture onward and from the oral tradition onwards, that there was going to be somehow or other a pure institution in the form of all of its members doing everything correctly. That's never been a claim that we made. Secondly, earlier in the program, I made the claim that when you look at our history in comparison with everything else, it doesn't look that bad at all. It doesn't look that bad at all. I mean, I'm just thinking of one thing that popped into my head. I mean, the first time you get a problem with a real crime in terms of a change of popes, not a martyrdom, but a crime, you're talking about reaching the late 800s. Whereas if you look at the Muslims with their caliphs and all of the rest, it's immediate. It's almost immediate that they've got all of these crimes that are taking place and wars that are taking place, not martyrdoms and the like. But I would go ultimately with this other argument, especially in the face of the open diabolical teachings and hypocrisy that we're facing on the part of all of our accusers today. I would go back to the argument that we talked about with that I've mentioned with regard to Louis Veuillot in his statements in the past. The problem with the Catholic Church is when, and with Catholics, is when they do not live up to what their teachings are. The problems with the people that we face is that come about when they do live up to the teachings that they are presenting. They're only good when they're not following the teachings that they are promoting. And in fact, they often, when we bring up the problems with the teachings that they promote, they say, oh, you're exaggerating because no one would really do the kind of things that you do. That's a famous argument that might be apocryphal with regard to Jeremy Bentham with his utilitarianism. Somebody is said to have asked him, well, what happens, with his principle of utility, 51% determining it? He says, what happens when 51% of Englishmen say that all the 49% of the others should be murdered? And he said an Englishman would never do that sort of thing. Well, they do, and they will, and they are underneath the kinds of arguments that people who always said that common sense would prevent anyone from going too far in these respects, they're doing all of this. And if you look at the pro-lifers knew this, have known this from the very beginning, that the people who were claiming at the beginning of the legalization of abortions that all they were concerned about was making it very rare and safe and the like, they knew in fighting these people that their real vision leads to what we have right now, which is a worldwide elite that is more and more demonstrating that it hates the human race. It wants to build a new Gnostic creation, and it has no respect for human life whatsoever. So I mean, again, my argument is the Catholic Church is what it's supposed to be when it does what it teaches, when it follows its leader, when it follows what its saints have done. It's bad when it doesn't live up to its own teachings. On the other hand, our opponents, they're only accidentally good when they don't live up to their teachings, which are rotten to the core.
Yeah.
Insofar as they veer away from what it is that faith and sound reason tell us.
Yeah. Another fascinating episode, Dr. Rao. Thank you so much for taking the time to get this all prepared. And I know you have a busy schedule, and we'll have you on for 2 more episodes, looking at some more scandals. Yay, I can't wait.
I'll change my clothing for those episodes.
Yeah, exactly. So thanks again. Have a great weekend, and we'll chat with you soon.
Okay.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Apologetics Series on the SSPX Podcast and on our YouTube page. Please consider subscribing to the YouTube account and the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or wherever fine podcasts are found. And please consider leaving a rating or a review on this podcast. This will help to make sure more people can find this podcast and discover the beauty and the truth of traditional Catholicism. Until next time, thank you for joining us, and God bless you.